Hi everybody, this is Candidate Master Khanya Mazibuko from ThinkChess, and today we'll be looking at aggressive positions which arise from opposite color bishop middle games. Whenever opposite color bishop middle games occur, usually each side will be able to play on one side of one set of squares, which could be either the dark squares or the light squares. So this not only means that on the opposite color, the attack will be really hard to be defended because you'll be almost a whole minor piece down when it comes to those positions. When dealing with opposite color bishop endgames, it is not always so much relevant about how much material you gain or lose because of their usual drawing nature in the endgame. So let's quickly look at the complications that could have happened in these positions. Let's start off with this position whereby Balogun with the white pieces is playing Adli, the Egyptian Grandmaster, in the World Cup Ganti Maskiak in the year 2009. So if we look at the position ahead of us right now, white has the bishop pair and has a huge strong knight on d5 and an open position. But at the same time, black also has two knights which are controlling very key squares, which is one on the c4 and also the other knight overprotecting the other knight on c6. Now, the bishop on g7 also creates a lot of pressure on the white king side, on the white queen side, but is not so easy to actually activate immediately. The game continued pawn to e6, trying to get this strong knight off the center. White continued, f takes e6 and f takes e6, and then after knight to e3 we have the position which has arisen. Now, obviously when dealing with the double bishops, we have to remember the three golden rules, which is bishops love open positions. Therefore, the more pawn exchanges which happen with the pawns in the center, the better the bishops become. Second rule is that always make the bishop without the counterpart the most active one. Reason is because there's no other piece that can challenge it, or no other bishop that can challenge it. That bishop usually becomes a very good attacking piece. And finally, the last advantage of having the bishop pair is always limit your opponent's outposts. So in this position right now, we can see that the knight on e5 is comfortably sitting there almost as in a good outpost. So a move maybe like bishop takes e5 would be something desirable for white, but not in this given position right now. White continued off. Black actually played here castles. White continued bishop e2, ready to take the king out of the center and play castle himself. And black now gets a clean grip on the e4 square with d5. And both sides having their own trumps. White has the bishop pair and no weaknesses whatsoever in his pawn structure, whilst black actually has 3 pawn islands but has a lot of attacking dynamism using the bishop on g7, the control of the c4 square, and his mobile pawn center. After a move like castles, black tried knight to g6, slowly but surely opening up the bishop on g7 and also controlling the important f4 square. White, being very tactical, realizes that the pawn on b7 is not such an importance to him. So moves like bishop takes b2 are possible, but would be wasting time, as after a move like bishop to b2, rook to b1 would chase the bishop away, and the pawn on b7 would be under attack at the same time. So he calmly plays pawn to c4, attacking the center and trying hard to exchange more pawns in that position, allowing his bishops to actually dominate the whole board. Knight to d4, trying to grab a bishop on e2, neutralizing white's double bishop advantage. After c takes d4 and knight and e takes d5, we now have this position arising again. The center is becoming more and more open, and as you can see now, black has the isolated d5 pawn, which is at the same time not only a pass pawn, but can become a weakness and a target for white to actually attack. White actually played bishop g4, moving the bishop away from the attack of the d4 knight. White continued, knight to f4, putting another knight into the outpost and having two active knights in the white camp. Not so easy for white to continue this position, but after careful consideration, a move like rook to c1 and asking black the simple question of what next puts the question into mind that the two bishops control almost the whole board as the game is becoming more and more open, and you start realizing two things might now start happening. The pieces started running out of squares. Let's take the bishop on g4. Black would love to play a move like rook to c8 and challenge this open file, but because that bishop on g4 is controlling that important c8 square, you can now realize the incapabilities that it comes with playing the black position. Queen a5, connecting the rooks, played by black, and after knight to c2, neutralizing the strong d4 knight, white slightly is getting more and more advantage as the game continues. Knight takes c2, rook takes c2, and after rook a to e8, bringing another rook into the open file, bishop to f3, pointing at the weak d5 square, rook has to come back to d8, and now bishop takes f4, reaching the position we want. After rook takes f4, we have the opposite color bishop endgame, middle game, which we were talking about. Now, in this position right here, it's not so relevant as to who actually has more material as to who can actually get in an attack. The first one to attack is usually the one who's most successful. And if we look at the position once again with its positional factors, you'd realize something very interesting. The black king is very much exposed. These pawns, pawn on h6 and pawn on g5, not only make a lot of light square weaknesses around the king, but make it very easy for white to actually find an attack. Whilst if you compare it with the white king, you would actually realize that he is super safe behind his pawn on f2 and g2 and h3. So it's no wonder that the attack starts rolling on its own. Rook e1, bringing another piece into the attack, played by white. Bishop f6 to defend the threat of rook e7. And after rook c to e2, the domination of the e file is now secure, and now the attack continues. King g7, getting the king off the light square. A really interesting defensive motive by black. Queen b1, slowly trying to bring the queen closer and closer to the black king, as the queen on b1 controls this important diagonal from b1 to h7. Black plays pawn to d4, trying to advance that mighty pawn and hopefully get a queen. But unfortunately, I don't think this is fast enough. Bishop b4, putting that bishop on that important diagonal and ready to create a blockade on the d3 square. Queen to c7, bringing the queen in closer to the game and also closer to the center. The queen on a5 unfortunately had not many roles, so therefore this is a very logical move. Queen to d3, blockading the strong d4 pawn. Bishop to e7, and now a3. Slowly but surely cutting all squares from the bishop on e7. Now a move like bishop b4 is almost an impossibility, and at the same time the scope of the bishop on e7 is running less and less, and meaning there is almost less attacking opportunities for the black side. Almost really great technique displayed from the white side, which is Grandmaster Bolligan. Bishop f8, bishop f5, controlling e6 square and threatening tricks like rook to e6 and rook to g6, already with a really great attack. Rook to d5, trying to attack the bishop on f5, bishop to e6, rook to d6, and now bishop to a2. Nice transferring of the bishop onto this diagonal on b1 behind the queen, creating what we know as a battery, a queen and bishop battery. This is almost completely lost because, unfortunately, the light squares, as we've pointed out around the king, prove very decisive and almost really hard to defend because of the opposite color bishop nature. Rook d to f6, trying to put pressure on f2, but unfortunately after bishop b1, it starts becoming very tactical. King g8, trying to defend the threat of queen to h7 check, which was going to skewer the queen and king. Now, rook e7, beautiful interference move, which almost secures the win for the white pieces. Bishop takes e7, queen h7, king f8, queen h8, king f7, and now bishop a2. Realize something. Not only is the combination of the queen and the bishop so overwhelming, but all the light squares are being dominated because the bishop is so strong on those squares, as the king unfortunately has no defense for those squares due to the lack of the strong light square bishop. King g6, and after queen e8, rook to f7, and queen g8, rook to g7, bishop back to b1, pawn to d3, king h5. Unfortunately, the king is forced into a really weird position. King takes g7, and the position is almost completely lost. Rook takes f2, trying to complicate matters, but calmly Balogun plays rook takes e7, not even worried about the rook on f2, and he's already realizing there's a lot of mating tricks with things like queen to g3 and queen takes h6, and the king is running out of great moves or squares at the time. Queen to c5, trying to get everything a bit controlled and threatening some nasty discoveries, say rook to f6 or even rook to f7, but nice and neatly, Balogun finishes the game in almost one swift move. I want you to pause the video and win this game for Balogun. I hope you found it. The idea of queen takes h6 check, and after king takes h6, rook to h7 checkmate. Beautiful attacking game due to the opposite color nature of the position. Let's look at another interesting example. In this game right here, it was played between world champion Willem Steinitz and Emanuel Lasker in the year 1896. The game started off with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, and bishop c5. The Italian game. Both sides calmly developed their king side slowly and try to castle and then have a grip in the center with moves like pawn to c3 and finally pawn to d4 for white, whilst black tries to develop his pieces also quickly, knight f6 and get castle in, trying hard not to violate any opening principles and neutralize the white advantage. Pawn to c3, knight to f6, both following through the plans, pawn to d4, trying to run over the black pieces. After e takes d4, c takes d4, bishop b4 check, and knight c3. This is a well-known gambit whereby after knight takes e4, white will just castle, and there's a lot of tactics, but not so much dangerous for black in nowadays chess, so it's not so popular. Bishop takes c3, main line, b takes c3, which is not a good idea. Usually the best move here is pawn to d5, trying to open up the game even more and utilize the fact that the two pieces are hanging. Not only is the bishop on c3 hanging, but now the knight in c6 and threats like rook to e1 are actually happening, or actually are even on the table. So it becomes a lot of fire, but as the complications end, you realize that black is still fine. After the move b takes c3, pawn to d5 just leaves black with a pawn up and an easy stable advantage. So Lasker goes bishop to a3, stopping his opponent from castling and trying to make sure that there is a lot of dynamism in this position. Now d takes c4 and now rook e1. In the position we have here is that we're gonna most likely lose the piece on e4, but after dropping that piece, we'll be left with a scenario whereby we'll have the opposite bishop on the board. And remember what we have spoken about. The opposite color bishops bring about a lot of attacking chances and a lot of tactics, making it a bit hard to actually prove that black is completely winning with this extra material. And if the king is stuck in the center, it might get a bit more dangerous than black could ever hope for. Bishop e6, defending the strong c4 pawn, and getting ready to castle queenside with moves after like queen d5 or queen d7. But rook takes e4, and now queen to d5. Ready to a castle and returning the rook on e4. Queen e2, long castles, and knight to e5. All active position for the white position. But the black player Emmanuel Lasker finds some interesting idea here. He starts off by bringing his rooks into the center. Rook h to e8, making sure all of his pieces are well developed and continuing the position. Knight takes c6, queen takes c6, and now rook a to e1 played by Willem Steinitz. Very aggressive position, but as this position goes on, you realize it's not so clear that white actually has an advantage. He might be faster than for black, but the extra material does kind of tell along another story. So rook to g8, trying to keep all of his pieces into the game and preparing a thematic push. g5, h5, and f5, trying to blast open the white king side and get ready to attack the white king. As you can see, there's almost no defenders around him. Rook e5, played by white, not only threatening ideas like rook to c5, but at the same time, ideas like rook to a5 or after bishop to c5. This is also a bit aggressive, but sometimes one may think, is this enough to actually secure an advantage? Pawn to b6 to stop any ideas with rook to c5, played simply by Lasker. Bishop c1, trying to transfer the bishop into a better diagonal, hence f4 or e3, but unfortunately, due to a move like g5, it's not so clear that white has an advantage. Rook takes g5, taking the sacrifice. Rook takes g5, bishop takes g5, and rook to g8. Now we see that thematic thing again. White has a solid king side, but at the same time, a lot of problems because the g file is open, which allows the rook on g8 to point towards the king, the queen on c6 to actually join into the attack of g2, and once again, the bishop on e6 will be a star key player when the light squares become super weak. Pawn to f4, defending the bishop, and now bishop to d5, making the bishop without the counterpart the most active and helping the attack to continue on a bit further. Threats like pawn to h6 now are up in the cards, or even pawn to f6. So g3 is almost really forced. King to b7, tucking the king into a square of the light square because it's almost impossible to be attacked because the light squares are almost all controlled by the black pieces. Pawn to h3, played by white. Queen to b5, slowly trying to sneak the queen closer and closer into the queen side, but as we realize more and more, this becomes really hard to defend. There's also a tricky or sneaky idea of creating a battery due to this very strong diagonal. Black wants to play bishop to c6 and queen to d5 and try to penetrate using this huge diagonal at his disposal. King to h2, the idea is after say rook to g6 and queen to c2, pawn to f6, bishop to h4 and bishop to c6, getting ready to realize that idea. Now you can see the reason why king to h2 was played. That move allowed the h1 square to be protected by the rook, the c2 queen to protect even the g2 square, but unfortunately due to these pieces having to stay on the first and second rank, they are tied down to the defense, meaning black is really much better. And one thing we always want to recall is that whenever you have an advantage, it is not only your duty, you have a right and a duty to attack, or else you run the risk of not realizing your advantage and even losing it. So after the move like g4, black plays queen d5, queen f2, and finally h5, throwing another pawn to the black king, making it really hard to actually keep his king side closed. g5 forced, as opening the g file would have been deadly because rook g2 was actually a threat. F takes g5, and finally bishop takes g5, trying to defend the g file using the bishop. Smart idea by white, but unfortunately not yet sufficient. h4, putting a noose around the king. As you've noticed now, the g3, g2, and h1 square are inaccessible from the white king. Only the g1 square is the only safe haven that is left for the white king. So rook f1, rook g8, queen e2, and a5. As you've noticed now, there's a nice little idea by black. He realizes his huge advantage. So slowly by surely, he tries to improve all of his pieces before he tries to launch an all-out decisive attack. So he wants to bring his pawn to maybe the a3 square to fix this weakness on the light square, allowing it to be attacked in the endgame, and also creating a lot of space on the queen side for black. Pawn to a4, stopped by white, and now rook e8, trying to highlight the fact that it's really hard to even challenge the file, as the h1 square will not be protected after the subsequent rook takes e1 and queen takes e1. Even the g2 square would be very weak. But after move like f5, rook back to g8, there are numerous threats which could be involving even rook takes g5 in some positions. After say rook to e1, queen takes f5, the position starts collapsing, unfortunately. The bishop on g5 is pinned so badly. The bishop is slicing through the white position, and the king is really naked right now. After move like rook to e5, trying to defend everything using the 5th rank, black actually calmly does not even waste time, continues putting a lot of pressure. Queen to f3, still securing all of the squares around the white king, making it harder for him to even escape. Pawn to d5, trying to stop the coordination of the queen and the bishop. But queen g3, king to h1, and queen takes e5 is not only winning a rook, but after say d takes e6, king takes e6, a pawn. And now we've realized that there's too much material advantage, so white actually decided to resign. A nice and classical game, which helped us actually understand the importance of an attack in opposite color bishop middle games. Let's look at the last example. Now, in this example, famous example played by Nidich and the current world chess champion Magnus Carlsen, in this position right here, white has huge control over the d5 square, but if you look at the position right now, he does not control that square with his bishop, as he has a dark square bishop, so the control over that square is not so much relevant to him. So in this position right now, the queen on d8 is inactive, the bishop on c8 is not active, and the knight on e7 is also pinned. So from hindsight, you might be thinking that black is almost dead lost. But the world champion finds a beautiful way of untangling this current position. f6, obviously cutting the pin and putting another pawn in the same color of your opponent's bishop not only minimizes the advantage of that bishop, but increases the advantage of your bishop, because that pawn now is in the opposite color of your bishop, allowing your bishop to even become much stronger. Bishop to e3, and now pawn to d5, fixing all of his problems almost with one swoop, almost leaving black with a great and equal game. Bishop c5, trying to put the bishop on a better square, as a move like pawn to d4 was actually threatened. So bishop c5, d takes e4, queen takes e4, threatening the rook on b8, and now queen to d5, happily wanting to exchange it to the endgame, which could actually mean a slight advantage for white, but nothing so big that it could be decisive. Now, Nadic, being a very aggressive and attacking player, wants to play for the win, tries to preserve the queen, and goes queen on e2. Now, bishop b7, putting a lot of pressure on the g2 square, and now utilizing the fact that that bishop is now the strongest piece on the board, controlling the diagonal from a8 until h1. And unfortunately, after a move like f3 gets a bit blunted. Knight to g6, bringing this important knight to the game and into the attack with moves like knight to f4, rook f to d1, knight to f4, queen to f1, and now queen to e6. Now in this position right now, it is still slightly better for white, as he's got a lot of pressure using the d-file, and the king cannot really castle. But Carlsen actually finds an interesting idea right here. Knight is very smart, realizes that he has better and he has to attack in order for him to realize his advantage. And remember guys, when you have the advantage, you have to attack, or else you run the risk of losing your advantage. So a move like c4, trying to open up the queen side and bringing the knight on a3 into the game, puts a lot of pressure already on the black position. But nicely, black finds an interesting way to continue this position. As I said at the beginning, material is not so much a huge benefactor when it comes to opposite color bishops because of their huge drawing nature in the endgame. So he sacks that pawn and goes king to f7, finally connecting the rooks and putting it on the square, whereby the white bishop does not have any way of actually attacking it. A nice defensive resource, and also a way to bring more dynamism into the position. Rook d6, attacking the helpless queen on e6, queen to f5, and after c takes b6, a takes b6, knight takes b5, a takes b5, knight takes b5, king g6. Now we've got this position in head. The black king, as weird as it might seem, is actually very safe on g6 because the black pieces control almost all the light squares, including this important b1 diagonal, and it becomes very evident in a couple of moves how that king on g6 actually makes sure that it's out of the way of the black attack. Rook e2, d2 actually protecting the important g2 square played by Nadic. Now rook h to d8 to neutralize the control of the d-file. Rook takes d8, almost forced because a move like rook to d8 would not only run into some tricks like rook takes a2 with the threats of the g2 square and using the huge diagonal to get in a huge attack, hence say like rook d1. Moves could continue, say not almost rook takes a2 on the spot could be a bit tricky because after moves like maybe rook a2, rook takes d1, queen takes d1, there could be threats with queen to g5 and knight to h3, bishop to f3, with all sorts of nasty things happening. And remember what we said, attacking on the light squares is almost easier because there are no defenders around the black king. In this position right here, after rook to d8, and knight to d6, forking the queen and the important bishop on b7. Now, remember how we need the bishop to be on an opposite color to allow us to have more drawing chances and attacking chances. So Carlsen quickly spots the fact that he cannot lose this very important piece and finds an interesting exchange sacrifice. Now, this is to show the importance of the quality of the pieces, but not the quantity of the pieces, which is really important. And he takes a nice idea of sacrificing on d6 with the plan that after bishop takes d6 and queen g5, there are too many threats on this diagonal and not enough pieces to defend the threats. Say after king h1, h5, now slowly but surely, trying to throw the h-pawn up the board and weaken this diagonal from h1 until a1, a8, allowing him to get more and more pieces into the attack. Bishop to c5, trying to bring his piece back. Carlsen does not waste time and goes e4 now, ready to open up this diagonal after, say, bishop to e3, trying to pin the knight to the queen. He continues, e takes f3, g takes f3, and now I hope you can actually pause the video and find the finishing move in this position, which led to a huge mating and attack. Did you find what the world champion has found? I hope you did. So in this position, he played queen to g4, using the fact that the pawn on f3 is actually pinned by the bishop on b7. And now you realize, there are not many pieces actually which can help defend the light squared pawn on f3. And this attack becomes very decisive, which forced his opponent, Knightage, to actually resign the game on the spot. Unfortunately, ideas like pawn to f3, h3 don't help because of things like knight takes h2, and there's too many pieces coming into the attack. And now it becomes evident on how strong the bishop on b7 truly is. And like that, bringing up the world champion an important point in this game. I hope you find this very instructive, and always remember that whenever dealing with opposite color bishop middle games, it is not always about the material, but always the activity of the pieces. Because if you can generate an attack, not only is it harder for your opponent to defend, because he actually has no extra minor piece to help him defend, but also it means greater attacking potential and almost a decisive advantage, I could say. So that is one thing I hope you could take from this lesson. This is Candidate Master Khanya Mazibuko from ThinkChess,